in our headlines on this Tuesday afternoon. US nuclear envoy Song Kim says the door to dialogue remains open to North Korea, but its displays of defiance will not be tolerated. The World Bank has lowered its outlook for the global economy this year to 3.2% from an earlier forecast of 4.1%, citing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And Ukrainian forces will be trained on using Howitzer artillery systems by the US military to bolster their defense against Russia's eastern offensive. It's good to have you with us. You're watching the Daily Report for Tuesday, April 19th here in Korea. I'm Min Sun-hee. Korea's daily COVID-19 infections have rebounded, according to health officials on this Tuesday. More than 118,000 new cases have been counted over the past 24 hours. The caseload is more than double that of Monday, as a greater number of people sought testing after the weekend. Also on this Tuesday, the country's first cases of the XE and XM variants have been detected. 2 cases of the XE strain and 1 of the XM were found. The XE strain is known to be 10% more transmissible than the regular Omicron variant. The streets of Seoul were bustling Monday night as people here welcomed their first night in more than 2 years of life in the absence of COVID-19 restrictions on the social front. Our Yoon Jungmin has some of those scenes.
After more than 2 years of efforts to stem the spread of the COVID-19 virus, things are starting to return to normal in terms of social distancing restrictions here in South Korea. On the first night of no limits on the size of social gatherings and no curfew on business hours, the streets late at night have become lively again, and waving down a taxi to get home has once again become a battle. People are excited about a return to normal life, which of course includes getting together with friends.
It's great because it feels like we are returning to normal life. It used to be difficult to even have dinner with friends, but now I'm happy because we can stay out until late in this nice weather.
This latest step towards returning to normal comes as exciting news for businesses as well.
I've waited a long time. Restrictions on business hours were lifted once in November, but I'm extremely glad that they've been lifted once again.
For bars, our business hours are late at night and into the morning, so a business hour curfew means we can't have customers. We've been waiting so long for the lifting of the social distancing measures. Not just us, it's welcome news for everyone.
While rallies and religious services return to full capacity, the face mask mandate remains in place, at least for another couple of weeks. Outdoor mask requirements may change first after health authorities monitor the COVID-19 situation in South Korea over the next 2 weeks. Yoon Jungmin, Arirang News.
And US health authorities have taken off some 90 countries from their do not travel list. Now, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on Monday local time lifted its level 4 do not travel recommendation for almost 90 international destinations. These places, including South Korea, France, Israel, Turkey, Australia, Russia and Japan, have now been moved to level 3, under which the CDC only discourages unvaccinated travelers. The CDC last week also said that it's reserving the level 4 travel notices for regions with special circumstances like escalating case counts or an emerging new variant. Meanwhile, China is poised to restart key production lines in Shanghai, but its zero-COVID strategy continues to overshadow economic prospects here and elsewhere. Min Suk-yeol explains.
Shanghai is on track to resume production after the Chinese government announced plans to help key industries get back to business in its commercial hub. Around 600 companies in the semiconductor, automobile, and medical sectors will resume operations. But some say starting production lines in Shanghai will not be easy, as it still remains difficult to bring workers to factories due to lockdowns. An added problem is that China's strict zero-COVID measures have also expanded to other regions, including the Jiangsu province.
About 22.8% of total Chinese imports come from Jiangsu province and around 16.5% from Shandong province, which is much larger than the imports from Shanghai. And in the case of Guangdong province, it is about 12%. So if COVID-19 spreads around there, the actual effect on us would be even greater.
Not to mention, China's lockdowns have already hit the auto industry, and it's not the only sector to be affected. South Korea is heavily dependent on Chinese imports, particularly in batteries and chips. So if productions in production lines were to continue, there would be a ripple effect on South Korea's economy as inventories of raw materials are running low. Min Suk-yeol, Arirang News.
In other news, U.S. nuclear envoy Song Kim has reiterated Washington's hopes for talks with Pyongyang over its nuclear and missile ambitions, while reaffirming the Biden administration's intentions to respond sternly to North Korea's blatant acts of defiance. Our Kim Dami reports.
Washington's top nuclear envoy Song Kim says that the U.S. is ready to talk with North Korea whenever and wherever, urging Pyongyang to come forward onto the path of diplomacy. He said this after meeting with his South Korean counterpart Roh Kyu-duk on Monday, 2 weeks after they last met in Washington.
And I think the fact that I'm back so soon after those consultations is an indication of our determination and commitment to maintain the closest possible coordination with the Republic of Korea on all aspects of DPRK issues and developments.
Kim also made sure to note that the U.S. harbors no hostility toward the regime and reaffirmed the South Korea-U.S. commitment to respond responsibly and decisively to North Korea's provocative behavior in the united context and beyond. Kim further voiced hope of working closely with No and his team during the government transition period. Seoul's top negotiator also stressed that close coordination between the two will be crucial as they navigate this increasingly precarious period, saying the two sides shared the concerns that the North's activities, raising tensions on the Korean peninsula, are likely to continue.
We should still leave the door open for dialogue. We should remain vigilant and guard against every possibility, and leave no room for any miscalculation on Pyongyang's part about the enduring strengths of ROK-US alliance.
No then said the two sides have agreed to take strong actions against the North at the UN Security Council if Pyongyang violates any resolutions, such as by carrying out nuclear tests and ICBM launches. Kim's 5-day visit to Seoul will include meetings with South Korean Unification Minister Lee In-young on Tuesday and with officials of the incoming Yoon administration, possibly with the Foreign Minister nominee Park Jin. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
The U.S. Department of Defense says the ongoing South Korea-U.S. combined military exercise well demonstrates Washington's commitment to Seoul's defense capabilities. Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby confirmed on Monday that the annual drill had begun while criticizing North Korea for responding to the U.S. calls for dialogue with more missile tests. He insisted diplomacy is the best way to rid the peninsula of nuclear weapons and reiterated that the Biden administration is open to talks with Pyongyang. In Europe, as part of efforts to strengthen their resistance against Russian invasion, Ukrainian forces will be trained on the use of Howitzer artillery by the U.S. military. Our Kim Yo-sun has details.
Washington plans to provide training for Ukraine's military on the operation of Howitzer artillery systems in the coming days. A senior U.S. defense official who spoke on condition of anonymity explained that the training would take place outside Ukraine. The official highlighted that the move comes as the Biden administration seeks to strengthen Ukraine's military against Russia's aggression in the eastern part of the country. The 155mm howitzer cannons are part of the America's additional weapons package to Ukraine worth $800 million. The package, which President Joe Biden announced last week, includes many of the highly effective weapons systems. The official further explained that there were roughly 76 Russian battalion tactical groups in southern and eastern Ukraine, which is an increase of about 11 in the past days. The official added that fighting still continues in the port city of Mariupol, which Russia is trying to take full control of. Meanwhile, Russian forces stepped up their attacks targeting the eastern Donbas region on Monday. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stressed that his country will not give away anything that is Ukrainian. Also on Monday, explosions rocked Lviv in a rare and deadly attack on the city located in the east of Ukraine. The city has been serving as a safe hub for refugees, Western officials, and the media. Ukrainian authorities say that at least 7 people were killed in the latest Russian missile strikes. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
And Russia's hostile campaign in Ukraine has prompted the World Bank to cut its growth forecast, that is, for the global economy for this year to 3.2%. Our Kim Yeon-sung reports.
The World Bank's global growth forecast for 2022 has been cut by nearly a full percentage point. World Bank President David Malpass said on Monday local time that the bank slashed the world's growth estimate from 4.1% to just 3.2%. The bank had already slashed its estimate by 0.2% back in January due to COVID-19 and supply bottlenecks. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine has forced it to slash growth rates by even more. The war in Ukraine has driven up food and energy prices. Europe and Central Asia have been hit hardest and are expected to contract by more than 4%. Malpass said this was the biggest factor behind the dimmer growth outlook. Malpass added that he expects to discuss with the board a new 15-month crisis financing package of $170 billion. This will support the world's poorest countries and ones that have accepted refugees from Ukraine. This proposed package is about $10 billion larger than the bank's earlier COVID-19 relief package. The world's top economic officials are to discuss the economic crisis during this week's spring meeting between the World Bank Group and International Monetary Fund, and also during the upcoming meeting of G20 finance chiefs and central bank governors. Meanwhile, on Tuesday, another growth projection is coming up. The IMF is expected to announce its first global economic outlook since the start of the war. Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva had said last week that the IMF will cut its forecast for this year and the next, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine sending shock waves across the global economy. And about 143 countries, or almost 90% of the world's economy, are expected to see downgraded growth rates. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
On the local political front, in commemoration of the 62nd anniversary of the April 19th pro-democracy revolution, President Moon Jae-in claimed the event paved a tangible path to democracy here in South Korea. In a post on his social media platform on this Tuesday, President Moon also extended similar credit to the May 18th pro-democracy movement and the Candlelight Revolution. Earlier in the morning, he was at the April 19th National Cemetery in Seoul to pay his respects to those who lost their lives during this demonstration. Meanwhile, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol, for his part, attended an event in northern Seoul to mark today's anniversary of the pro-democracy movement and vowed to continue the April 19th spirit for freedom and prosperity. The Presidential Transition Committee has been framing out a blueprint for the new administration for about a month now. Policies that do not require legislative approval will be among the first to be announced in the coming days. I have Lee Kyung-won with that.
Yoon's Transition Committee will be announcing some of the new government's key policies over the next 2 weeks. A full list will come on May 2nd, 1 week before Yoon takes office. There will mainly be policies that don't require any changes to the current law. That's because the soon-to-be main opposition Liberal Democratic Party holds parliament majority, while Yoon's Conservative People Power Party will hold the government.
The scope of policies could be limited due to the difficulties in passing laws, so we will push for those that won't require legislation so we can get things done in a speedy manner.
But the much anticipated housing policies, the biggest concern among South Koreans, are not likely to be announced yet. The committee is trying to avoid any confusion that may occur due to a sporadic release of information, especially with related discussions expected to take place at the upcoming parliamentary hearing for land and finance minister nominees.
Due to the possibility of an overlap or a change in messages which could cause chaos to the market, we are strongly considering the idea that the new government announces a final comprehensive outline to the real estate policies.
However, the transition team is already fine-tuning the roadmap on COVID-19 for the Yoon administration's first 100 days in line with vision of science-based virus prevention. In addition to the immediate agendas, the transition team said it is setting up long-term goals that may require more than the 5-year presidential term, yet are deemed necessary for national development. While leaving just 3 weeks, the committee's chair vowed to maintain all-out efforts, saying the successful launching of the government largely depends on the success of the transition team. And how the Yoon government kicks things off is especially important with another test at the polls coming up in local elections on June 1st, just weeks after Yoon takes office. 이경은, Arirang News.
And President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol believes the economy and security are intertwined. Now, remarks to this end were shared at a forum here in Seoul earlier on Monday that sought to promote dialogue on matters of national and global interest. Our Yoon Jungmin has more.
President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol emphasized the importance of South Korea's economic security for the incoming government, saying economy means security and security means economy. At the Seoul Forum for International Affairs on Monday, he said the vision for economic security discussed at the forum seems to reflect the tasks of the new government.
새 정부가 우리 경제 재도약을 위한 기틀을 닦고 경제 안보의 시대를 철저히 대비해 나가겠습니다.
At the forum, one suggestion was to create a task force on integrated economic security under the presidential office to enable prompt pan-governmental responses to comprehensive risks involving diplomacy, security, economy, environment, and science and technology. Also suggested was that Seoul should host a global forum on democracy and the future. Participants pointed out the increasing global uncertainties affecting South Korea and the international community.
Today, due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the international community is living through a new nightmare resembling the return of the law of the jungle and the imperialism of the 19th century.
Participants included former Environment Minister Kim Myung-ja, the chairman of the Asan Foundation Chung Mong-jun, and a number of former government officials and university professors. From the business world, participants included the chairman of the Korea International Trade Association Gu Jae-yeol and SK Group chairman Choi Tae-won. Yoon Jungmin, Arirang News.
Some 5 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee their country amid Russia's assault, according to the latest count by the UN. Now, most have sought refuge in Poland, but a few have made the long journey here into Korea. Our Kim Sung-min has their story.
Before dawn on February 24th, the Russian offensive began across Ukraine. That's when 42-year-old Korean Ukrainian Park Tatiana realized her life was forever changed.
I woke up at 5 a.m. after hearing bombing 3 times. I was terrified, and it's really hard to even recall it.
To find safety, she went first to Moldova and again to Romania before she finally arrived in South Korea.
It's difficult to see a war like this in a generation of peace. I just don't want anyone to go through anything like this.
Also landing on Korean soil a few weeks ago is 28-year-old Kim Olena. She had to leave behind her beloved husband in Mykolaiv when her baby started getting sick. She took a 41-day journey with her 72-year-old grandmother and her 2 kids, one who just turned 1 last week.
My husband is not allowed to leave overseas as he has to protect the city, and it was so scary to see all the ranks of troops with guns. I wouldn't have been able to do it if it weren't for my kids.
After weeks of restless nights, they finally found peace in the South Korean city of Gwangju. Gwangju has become home to thousands of ethnic Koreans, Koryoin, the descendants of Korean diaspora in Russia, who were forced out to Central Asian countries as well as to Ukraine. Now, it serves as a shelter for Korean Ukrainians who fled from the war thanks to the Koryoin Support Center located in a small area of the city called Koryoin Village.
So far, around 80 Koryoin, including the ones I've met today, have been coming to the support center since they arrived in South Korea. They usually come to express their gratitude and to get basic necessities like clothing and food.
When Shin Jo-ya, the head of the center, saw that war broke out, she first wanted to save at least one person. But soon, her efforts were echoed by others who gave their help, allowing her to invite many more, including a child who had her first good night's sleep in days.
The mother said her baby slept well for the first time. Hearing that, I cried with all my heart.
And that support continues to arrive, from a truck full of necessities to helping hands from neighbors.
I heard they are having difficulties with clothing because they had to leave in a hurry, so I decided to join the effort.
Here at the center, refugees can take various programs, like this lesson to help them get a foreigner registration. Half of the kids in this class are evacuees from the war in Ukraine. They'll get to learn about Korean culture here and hopefully will feel at home soon. The center hopes to keep supporting Korean refugees, both those taking shelter temporarily and others aiming to start a new life here. Even though most of them say it is unclear what future holds for them, they all wish to deliver the same message.
When I left the country, I felt so lost, not knowing what to do next. Then I arrived here to receive such a welcome from the Korean village. I truly want to thank South Korea and the people here, and I wish them all the best.
김성민, 아리랑 뉴스, 광주.
A growing number of people are seeking comfort from plants to help them deal with the psychological stress aggravated by the prolonged pandemic. Our Cho Sung-min explains.
This botanical garden-themed cafe in Gyeonggi-do province attracts a countless number of visitors every weekend. It has endless rows of tamarinds and coral bells flowers and has an exotic feel. The spring atmosphere and the aromas from the flowers make it a peaceful place to be.
My two sons are very energetic. When they're off to kindergarten and school, I find peace looking at the plants.
Staff in the cafe are also plant experts who give suggestions to customers on what plants they should grow. They say the number of customers has increased as more people are seeking comfort in nature.
Because we are all spending more time in a closed space, we have 20 to 30% more visitors than a year ago who want to get some fresh air and time for comfort.
The growing number of plant owners has led to the creation of a new facility catering to their needs, a plant hotel. It takes care of the plants for customers when they are unable to do so. All these plants here in this hotel have owners. The facility will look after them until the owners come back. Most customers are people who live alone and have gone away on business or vacation.
With more newlywed couples and long-distance travelers, we expect to have more customers moving forward.
There are also online plant hospitals that offer medical assistance. This plant hospital in Gyeonggi-do province has had over 60,000 clients in just a month. Users upload photos and descriptions of their plant's condition, and botanists give them specific advice on how to treat them.
It appears that more people have started growing plants because of COVID-19. As for the online plant hospital service, nearly 80% of the cases are about plants grown at home.
Industry experts point to the pandemic as being behind the increase in plant interest, as their therapeutic effects can help relieve stress.
Visually, the color green has a soothing effect on people. Growing plants can be psychologically comforting to people as well.
With the pandemic expected to prolong for the foreseeable future, the size of the plant market and the number of new plant owners are also expected to expand across the country. Cho Sung-min, Arirang News.
Korea is the priciest place to raise children from birth to the age of 18 in terms of average income. Now, China has been found to rank second and Italy third. This is according to research by Jefferies Financial Group, which looked into 14 different countries. For more, I have Frank Smith with Deutsche Welle live on the line. Frank, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Good to be here. Thanks, Sanahi.
I also have freelance journalist Jack Barton here in the studio. Jack, it's good to see you again.
It's great to be here.
Right, Frank, we'll start with you. Let's begin then with a bit more details about this particular research, which was reported by CNN last week.
Well, it came from the Jefferies Financial Group Incorporated, and it analyzed spending on childcare up to the age of 18 as a percentage of GDP, gross domestic product. It looked at this kind of in a broad context to try to put this into perspective, you know, when you're analyzing across country with different metrics. So, for example, in the West, college education, often young people, they'll take out loans, and so that wasn't really factored in to the expense that parents paid in the education of their children. And also, it looked at the taxation a little bit and the provision of public and private services. And what I found really most interesting was that the Jefferies Financial Group is a financial services company that really concentrates on wealth management. And you'd think that it would have sort of a very conservative perspective on issues like this, on social issues like this. And in fact, it advocated an increase in terms of state provisions for childcare, which you'd find astonishing. It also pinpointed, especially China and South Korea, for being high on that spending category of those up to 18. Sun-hee?
Right, and staying with that then, Jack, like Frank just mentioned, countries in the Far East, that is South Korea and China, top the list, standing at first and second place respectively, followed by Italy in third place. What are your personal thoughts on these findings?
I think there's a number of factors. One is, as Frank mentioned, it's comparative per capita of GDP. So we're not talking about it being the most expensive, but being the most expensive in terms of an income that the parents have. So over here, it's more than $100,000. In China, it's about $75,000 to raise a child to 18. If you told that to someone in America that only have to spend $75,000, they'd be jumping for joy, probably planning a family of 5. But here in China, those are bigger costs. Another factor is that outside of East Asia, in most countries, people tend to aim for bigger families. One of the reasons, because those comparative costs are lower, so maybe a family of 2 or 3. But here you see parents having far fewer families, and you know, South Korea amongst one of the lowest birth rates in the world, if not the lowest. So when they do have a child, they tend to be willing to spend more on that child as well. And then one of the factors that play into that here, of course, is the incredible tutoring that goes on in South Korea. When I describe to people back in Australia how much out-of-school hour tutoring goes on here and the expense involved, they don't actually even believe me. So that all adds up more. And then, of course, there is childcare before they go to school. I know the government's tried to make it free, but we know that people are spending about 198,000 won, or about $162 a month on that. So all of those costs adding up really to make this a very, very pricey place to raise a child.
Right. Jack, the universal understanding is that childcare is expensive everywhere. And keeping in mind what Jack himself has said, Frank, what do you believe is the reason behind this particular reality here in the Far East then?
Well, I think we might have to go back to a Confucian influence in terms of education. South Koreans in particular are obsessed with education and childhood education. And so I think that plays into it. As Jack mentioned, he talked about private education institutes, what are called hagwon here in South Korea, and the propensity of parents to send them to several different institutes and have several different tutors come into the home basically on a weekly basis. And really there's kind of no ceiling to that. Also, I think in South Korea you have stronger familial responsibilities. I think families are a little bit closer knit here, so there is that, I think, degree of responsibility in terms of parenting is a little bit stronger here in South Korea, perhaps than in the West, where you might say to your 10-year-old child, you know, go out of the house and play around and come back when the sun comes down. South Koreans really don't have that kind of attitude and keep their children on a much shorter leash.
Right. Jack, speaking within your capacity as a well-traveled journalist, then, how do you explain Italy's high expenses in child rearing?
Because Italy, in many ways, is very similar to Korea and China. It has a very low birth rate, the lowest in Europe. It is very pricey there. There's a huge bureaucracy, and while the cost of secondary education is perhaps a little bit cheaper than here. The cost of childcare there is astronomical. So if you look at the north of Italy, I mean, we mentioned about $162 a month here. In the north of Italy, it's more closer to $670 a month. Even in the south, which is much poorer, it's still about $450 a month in childcare. So you do have all of these pressures. You have wages that are very similar to South Korea. So the average per capita wage is very similar. And so when we look at the actual dynamics, even though Italy is sitting in there in the European Union, in Europe, when we crunch the numbers down, it's actually very similar. The social circumstances are similar, the financial circumstances are very similar to South Korea.
Right, and back here in South Korea then, Frank, keeping in mind the causes of the costly childcare here in the country that you shared, what do you recommend as part of efforts to ease this financial burden, so to speak?
Well, I would agree with the sort of rough conclusions that came out of this report. Expand and improve the public education and community services system. If we look at, we've got to look at this in sort of a comprehensive way. To just pinpoint one thing I don't think is quite fair. We need to look at the tax rates in South Korea, 37% personal tax, 25% corporate tax, and look specifically at the social welfare spending, which in South Korea is, pretty close to the bottom of the OECD at just about 12.2%. And then the household benefits that are paid out of that is at the very bottom of those countries' reporting data. So I would argue that South Korea needs to consider, increasing perhaps its taxation and investing that money in public education and public community services.
Right. Well, Jack, people say it takes a village to raise a child. And keeping in mind what Frank has just said, do you suppose the government here does need to shoulder a heavier burden?
I do think that the government needs to shoulder a heavier burden, but there also needs to be a cultural shift as well. There's always a big race in South Korea to get into those big three universities. We know the names, the SK and the Y, and perhaps too much attention is focused, and so too much money is spent trying to get the children into those areas. If there was a more level playing field in terms of high schools, in terms of universities, if there was more a sense of getting a piece of paper that will get you a good job from many other educational institutions, I think there'd be a lot less pressure, a lot less money spent, and part of that would be, a large part of that would come through a government effort to ensure there was quality education right across the boards at many institutions, even though at the moment there might be, and the perception might be just that you're getting it at those few. So definitely, look, there always education. There needs to be more money spent on education because that ensures a prosperous next generation. Education and infrastructure and health are always the key. But at the same time, I think there needs to be a bit of a cultural shift here as well.
Right. Frank, this research by Jefferies Financial Group looked into the costs of feeding, clothing, educating as well as entertaining children. Now, with regard to the latter, that is entertaining children, what are your thoughts on the availability of affordable entertainment venues for children here in South Korea?
Well, I just want to go back first to comment a little bit on what Jack said, and I really agree with what he said. And, young people here are being educated, very highly, as we mentioned, but it's being divided between public and private, too much on the private end, and that doesn't result in what we want to see, which in a democracy, in a meritocracy, which is equal opportunity. Now, when we talk about, entertainment services, many of them are private. I look out my window, I live in a high-rise here, there's a lot of density in terms of, living space, residential living space, but a very small playground for my apartment in a private area. And a public playground and public facilities are a little bit few and far between comparatively. So I think South Korea could really do a lot more in terms of public park space, public play areas. If we talk about, say, swimming pools, I have to, get in a car to go to a private swimming pool. And, free open swimming, when I was a child, for example, I could walk to a swimming pool 2 blocks or a few blocks in a couple of directions to get to one, and I could go to free open swimming. I wouldn't have to register for a class. I could go to free open swimming any sort of day. I myself taught tennis for a community center that was heavily subsidized by the government, so that anybody with just a few dollars to spend could spend some time in sort of tennis recreation. So I think South Korea could really learn a lesson in terms of broadening its social community spending. Sunhee?
Right. Jack, beyond Korea, your country, Australia, ranked quite favorably on that particular list. Now, child rearing in Australia was found to cost 2.1 times in the country's average GDP per capita. Do you care to explain this reality over in Australia for us?
Yeah, of course, that's much lower than South Korea or China or other. But there's fairly simple reasons behind this. One is that we have some of the highest wages in the world. In fact, we have the highest minimum wage in the world at almost $15 US. That's about 2/3 higher than even in the United States. But also on top of that, there's very good state-funded education, and there's a lot of trust in it. So private schools exist. Private schools are expensive. People with the money might be inclined to send their children there, but that's not to say that if you want to be the Prime Minister or a CEO of a company, you actually have to go to one of those schools. You can just as easily have come from a state school, and state schools will cost you anywhere up to $500 a year in fees. So, you know, the fees are so low you could almost say they're almost non-existent, and on top of that you have a very, very high income. But apart from that, I would say it's more on the trust in state institutions, and it's more on the high level of education in state institutions that is a much bigger fact than the actual income.
Right, and here's the million-dollar question then, Jack. How do you suppose was that trust in state institutions fostered?
By spending in state institutions, by trying to attract good teachers into state institutions. And obviously in the private schools, there's always going to be an imbalance there because they will be able to pay a little bit more, but you know, the quality of teachers is high. State schools try to attract, and some of the state schools try a little harder than others. In fact, there's one state school in Melbourne that essentially has the same reputation as a private school, if not better. So people try and compete to get into this state school. But overall, it's a very level playing field. What you might get in a private school is a little bit more specialised education, particularly when it comes to music or the arts or this sort of thing. But across the board, when we're talking about maths, sciences, you're likely to get just as good an education in a state school. And that's a very conscious policy. It's not a chance. And Australia is used to be at least, an egalitarian society, and there'd be a sense of outrage if the schools didn't function in that way.
Right. Frank, now I understand you've been away from your country, Canada, for quite a while now, but could you share with us a bit about the cost of child rearing in Canada and the support perhaps available to working parents there?
Well, working parents in Canada get a child stipend of $500 per month per child. So it does get some support there. And also when we talk about those other programs surrounding school, for example, here in South Korea, my daughter goes to school from 9 to 12 usually, sometimes 9 to 2, but usually just 9 to 12, and then it's perhaps an after-school program. Whereas when I grew up in Canada, I went to school from 9 o'clock until 3 o'clock. And then in my elder grades, in grade 5, 6, 7 in elementary school, I could play on teams and stay busy in the afternoons as well. So the school day here is much shorter. And I think, you know, to reiterate what Jack was saying about trust, I don't think the South Korean public and South Korean parents really trust the public school system. And that's one of the reasons that they do so much private tutoring. Often, you know, educators would kind of point out that children are sleeping when they go to public education, and then they wake up to really study hard and take seriously their studies at private institutes, at academies, at hagwons here.
Right.
So
now, Frank, you've set yourself up now. I'm going to ask you a difficult question. Based on your observations then, as a foreigner looking into the academic situation here in the country, what do you suppose is the reason perhaps for this lack of trust within the public education here in the country?
Well, I think it's something that really developed over time. You know, I would say that the privatization of the education system and that happened over time. It's not something that you can dial back easily. You have very strong vested interest groups in the private education sector that want to see their market protected. Fixing that is going to take the kind of private spending that they do in Australia. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Jack pointed out very accurately the priorities that the government in Australia has in making private education and public education, and specifically public education, equal in terms of its quality. And that's going to be expensive.
Right. And Jack, back to you then. So it's been established by this latest research that Korea is the most expensive country to raise a child in terms of average income. Having said that, is it money well spent in terms of education, do you think?
Well, I think this all feeds into something that, Frank was just talking, and you were talking about why is it the imbalance, and I think some of it has come from the history of Korea. If we look at the development of the economy and of the education system, it's come so recently and so fast, and of course the private schools were some of the first to establish big educational institutions, so it was natural that they got a lot of kudos. But now if we move forward, I would say, part of me wants to say any amount of money spent on education is money well spent, but the other half of me thinks that if you're spending all of that money just to get your child into the right university, and then once they get in there, it's just, okay, we'll just study enough now to pass, having the bit of paper with the university name on, that's the important thing. I'd kind of say, no, it's not money well spent. Because you're not, university is where you really need to focus and get that quality, the quality information that you're seeking. And the other thing is there's too much focus on rote learning, and that feeds into this cram tutoring. So you're not getting a critical thinking. Good critical thinking in the education system. And for South Korea, that is so important, because you're not going to get good high-tech science research and development without that focus in the education system. So there's too much focus on rote learning just to get you into one of these universities, and not enough attention paid, of course, to getting into a multitude of well-funded universities, and then focusing in the university, and focusing not just on what you're learning but how you're learning it, to be more critical about what you're learning, so when you come out you've really got that mind that can develop new things for the country.
Right. And not that I disagree with you, but Frank, keeping in mind what Jack has just said, there are pundits there who do claim that the availability of such private institutions for education, which also include quite a lot of subjects not covered at school. For example, you could have dancing classes taught in English for your child if he or she is interested in it. And that kind of exposure, that kind of availability has, in essence, pushed our economic standard to world levels. What are your thoughts on that, Frank?
Well, I agree with you. I think, something like dancing, or, let's say Taekwondo, that's very popular here, being serviced by private education, private institutes, is a great idea. What I think we see too much of is things like math and science and English language study done at private institutes that could be and should be in a sort of equanimous society, an egalitarian society, done in the private education system. And that's, again, what I would advocate.
Right. Frank, with regard to money well spent then, in terms of ensuring a safe environment for child growth, what are your thoughts?
There's no ceiling to what you will spend. I'll use the analogy that we use in politics, talking about national security. There's no ceiling to what a country will spend to ensure its national security. And as a parent, there's no ceiling to what I'll spend in terms of my daughter's education. I'd like to see her do more of that in school. And also, I think it's important to recognize what Jack mentioned about what they're studying, how they're studying as young people. There's too much rote learning going on, and too much emphasis placed on education as a young person. And then when they have that, mental and social capacity to discuss and learn more complicated things, they're considered to be already sort of done when they get into their freshman university and junior university years, when they should be really dialing up that critical thinking education.
Right. Hopefully there will be improvements in the future, of course, then. Frank, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Jack here in the studio, thank you for your insights today.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In South Africa, a week after torrential downpours and massive flooding, 10,000 troops have now been deployed to the KwaZulu-Natal province. According to South African National Defence Force, on Monday they have been instructed to support cleanup efforts, give medical assistance and provide transport aid. The latest reports put the death toll at 443, with 63 people still unaccounted for. While the overall cost of infrastructure damage has now reached $684.6 million. Now this comes as floods left thousands homeless, without power and water services, and disrupted operations at one of Africa's busiest ports located in Durban. Premier of the province, Zikhle Sikalala, said that the floods were among the worst in the region's recorded history. In India, communal clashes in New Delhi have seen 23 people arrested during a festival procession in the Jaharang-Irpuri district. The conflict occurred on Saturday when joint police paramilitary personnel were dispatched to the area following clashes between the majority Hindu and minority Muslim communities. According to authorities, 6 police officers and several others were injured in the scuffle, which saw 14 initially arrested, with another 9 suspects identified later through CCTV footage. This follows another incident where bricks were thrown at a police team attempting to arrest another suspect. Tensions have risen in India as hardline religious groups have adopted courses they say defend the Hindu faith. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's nationalist Hindu party has denied there has been any rise in communal tensions. Flight tickets are surging in price in light of the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Ticket prices are being driven up by high oil prices and airlines being forced to take longer routes to avoid Russian airspace. According to the Wall Street Journal, the most widely affected route has been the East Asia-Europe passage, with many planes now using the Arctic passage instead. What was once a 9-hour flight from Helsinki to Tokyo now takes about 13 hours. The increase in flight time has also led to fewer flights, and some carriers have removed smaller destinations. If supply remains restricted, ticket prices are likely to soar even higher as demand picks up after the end of the pandemic restrictions. Currently, Russian aircraft are banned from entering European airspace, while Russia has also issued a ban on airlines from 36 countries. Hiba Zain, a 24-year-old Syrian woman, has been spending a lot of time in her car during the holy month of Ramadan. The media student has been busy collecting fast-breaking evening meals from charities and delivering them to those in need. With fuel and transportation costs rising in the country, many families have been unable to travel to charities, prompting Zain to use her own car to deliver meals. Starting with individual food packages, she quickly moved from transporting 3 meals a day to over 30. The number of people in need in Syria is high, with UN figures showing there were 14.6 million people living in poverty in 2021, an increase of 1.2 million from 2020. This means that with Syria's population of around 18 million people, almost 2/3 live in extreme poverty. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Tuesday afternoon. It was a bit chilly in the morning, but things have turned right around. April sunshine is rapidly pushing the highs to the mid-20s, leading to wide gaps in readings. Again, it's quite typical at this time of year, so please keep yourself warm on your evening commute. And if there was no ultrafine dust, we could just enjoy the spring weather. But due to the lack of air circulation and a massive influx from overseas, the ultra dust fine level is quite high in central and western parts. So you do need a face mask. And another crispy day with low humidity is in the forecast. So we do have to keep in mind the dry weather advisory concentrated in inland regions. And if you have to deal with fire, just make sure to put it out completely with water or ash. So until this weekend, the sunny and dry spell should continue. And I just want to repeat the same message that we can't be too careful when dealing with fires. Now let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
And that is all the time we have for this edition of the Daily Report. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Thank you for now.